In front of 6.2 million viewers, a Black War refugee was forced to take an IQ test live on national TV. 36 seconds later, he pulled a sealed letter from his pocket, and what happened next left a rising political star on the brink of collapse. But here's the real question. How far would someone go to silence a man who's been fighting injustice his entire life? They said she was born in a spotlight. Not literally, of course, but from the moment Jasmine entered the world in a Georgetown hospital suite, lined with security guards and television cameras outside, the air around her was electric with expectation. Her father, Senator Franklin, a towering figure of post-Watergate reform politics, once joked on air, "My daughter's first words will be filibuster." He wasn't far off. By the time she turned 15, Jasmine had written op-eds for the Washington Post that earned national attention. At 23, she graduated top of her class at Stanford. At 28, she flipped a red district blue in a shocking congressional race. By 35, she was being whispered about as the future first female president. And now at 38, Jasmine stood on a sleek marble podium in front of a sea of microphones, her eyes gleaming under the studio lights as if she were staring straight into history itself. "America deserves transparency," she said, her voice sharp and precise, every syllable polished, every breath measured. "And our leaders should be held to the highest standards. That includes intellectual readiness for 21st century governance." Behind her, a massive LED screen came alive with bold red letters, "The IQ Challenge, a test for truth, live, nationwide, unedited." The room buzzed. Cameramen adjusted their lenses. Journalists sat upright in their chairs, sensing a moment that could change the political landscape, or at the very least break the internet. What Jasmine proposed was audacious. A televised IQ test moderated by a panel of psychologists and data scientists designed to vet the cognitive sharpness of every senior candidate running for national office. The first to be tested, her primary opponent, Jean-Baptiste Traoré. The room tensed at the name. Traoré was a living paradox, a Senegalese-American war refugee who became a constitutional lawyer, a civil rights organizer turned Senate candidate, beloved by community leaders, feared by establishment elites. In recent months, he'd gained traction across unlikely demographics. Veterans, progressives, even moderate conservatives who saw in him a strange and powerful authenticity. Jasmine never mentioned him by name in the press conference. She didn't need to. The dog whistle was loud enough. The test, she said, would be voluntary, but revealing, and it would be live, in front of the nation. A reporter raised his hand. "Congresswoman Crockett, isn't this just political theater?" She smiled, the kind of smile that's more blade than curve. "Only if someone has something to hide." It was subtle, but her tone sliced through the room like glass. Behind the cameras, her campaign manager nodded with approval. This was strategy, not spectacle. A calculated move to box Traoré into a corner, take the test and risk looking unqualified, or refuse and look afraid. Either way, she'd own the narrative. What no one saw not yet was how tightly wound Jasmine really was. Not with fear, but with hunger. Behind the curated idealism and confident posture, there lived a quiet desperation. This wasn't just politics, this was personal. For years, she'd played by the rules her father carved out of granite. Appear perfect. Think faster. Smile only when necessary. Always anticipate your opponent's move before they make it. And Traoré, for all his calm charisma, was too unpredictable, too respected, too dangerous. If she couldn't out-debate him, she would outflank him. And what better way than to frame it as civic duty? The internet exploded. Hashtags like Down IQ Challenge, Team 25, and Hananai Traoré test trended worldwide. Some called it genius. Others called it grotesque. Talk shows debated its ethics. Late-night hosts had a field day. But underneath the viral headlines, whispers began to stir. Why now? Was this about democracy or ego? And who exactly was afraid of being exposed? Even among Jasmine's most loyal allies, quiet doubt flickered. Back at her campaign headquarters, Jasmine stood alone by the window, looking out over the city as dusk bled into amber. Far in the distance, the Capitol dome glowed like a lighthouse or a warning. She took a breath and pressed a button on her desk phone. "Confirm the test date," she said coldly, "and make sure Traoré gets the invite. Personally." She hung up. Then almost imperceptibly, her hand trembled. The news reached him late in the afternoon, somewhere between folding donated blankets and preparing soup for the evening crowd. Jean-Baptiste Traoré stood in the corner of a worn-out community center kitchen, his sleeves rolled up, stirring a massive aluminum pot with slow, practiced movements. The smell of lentils and cumin filled the room. It was Tuesday, and Tuesday nights were his to serve. A young volunteer barely out of college ran in breathless, holding up his phone. "Sir, you're trending." Traoré raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The boy stammered, "Jasmine Crockett. She just challenged you to an IQ test on national television." There was a pause, a long one. Traoré's gaze drifted from the steam rising off the pot to the small television, mounted in the corner, where the news cycle was already looping clips from Jasmine's press conference. A test for truth, she had said, her voice polished and confident, her image larger than life. He listened, not with anger, not even surprise, but with a stillness that unnerved the young man beside him. "I see," Traoré finally said, reaching for a towel to wipe his hands. He didn't ask for details. He didn't rush to a phone or demand a press release. Instead, he walked out quietly to the dining hall, where 36 unhoused men and women waited for their first hot meal of the day. One by one, he greeted them by name. He'd seen challenges before real ones, bombs and blood and betrayal. He'd escaped war-torn Dakar at 14, fled across oceans on cargo ships with a forged passport, and a brother who didn't survive the journey. He'd scrubbed dishes in Boston diners, learned English from discarded library books, and earned a full scholarship to Harvard Law before he ever had a Social Security number. By 40, he was a federal prosecutor. By 50, he'd resigned to fight wrongful convictions. By 60, he had organized youth literacy programs in 7 counties and helped overturn 3 death row sentences. His resume was long, but his home was small. A 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store lined with books, not plaques. Now at 62, they called him the quiet insurgent. That evening, a local journalist finally reached him outside the shelter. "Mr. Traoré, will you accept Jasmine Crockett's challenge?" He looked into the camera, face weathered but eyes unwavering. He did not smirk. He did not flinch. "I don't fear questions," he said. "Let the people see for themselves." Those 8 words echoed across newsrooms and living rooms that night. Within hours, pundits rushed to interpret his calm reply. Some called it dignified, others called it naive. The press hunted for signs of panic in his camp, but there were none. His campaign manager, a former schoolteacher named Helena Nguyen, simply said, "We'll be there. No counterattack, no hashtags, no damage control, just an old man with a long memory and steady hands." Still not everyone was convinced. Traoré's walking into a trap, one CNN panelist warned. "This isn't a debate, it's a show. And Jasmine controls the script." But what they didn't understand, what Jasmine perhaps underestimated, was that Traoré had never played by their rules. He didn't chase attention, he didn't spin, and he didn't bluff. Instead, over the next few days, he went on doing exactly what he'd always done, visiting food banks, sitting on folding chairs in church basements, hosting town halls in barbershops and bingo halls. He answered questions with honesty, even when it hurt. He didn't talk about IQ, he talked about evictions, about rural hospitals closing, about foster kids slipping through cracks and elderly voters with no transportation to polling sites. When a reporter asked if he was preparing for the test, he said only, "I prepare every day by listening." And when they asked why he wouldn't criticize Jasmine's tactics, he replied, "If I tear her down, I teach people to cheer for the fall. I'd rather teach them how to rise." Word by word, gesture by gesture, he reminded the nation of something long forgotten in politics: restraint. By the time the test date was announced, something strange had begun to shift. The story had started as a game show, a spectacle. But now people leaned forward not to laugh or jeer, but to see what Traoré might do next. To see how far a man could go, not by yelling louder, but by standing firmer. And far away in a glass-walled office in Washington, Jasmine Crockett watched those same clips with an unexpected knot in her chest. She had set a trap for a man, but she was beginning to suspect. She'd awakened a movement. The Eisenhower Freedom Hall had never hosted anything quite like this. It was once a venue for presidential inaugurations, peace accords, and state funerals. Tonight it was transformed into something different, part academic stage, part gladiatorial arena. Spotlights washed the marbled columns in hues of red, white, and blue. The presidential seal was projected softly on the floor, just behind two plexiglass podiums. A buzz rippled through the crowd like static. Reporters jostled for camera angles. Tech crews whispered into earpieces. Security personnel dressed in black with earpieces and tactical posture watched every movement. It wasn't just another debate night. It was a performance wrapped in policy spectacle, masquerading as scrutiny. The nation had tuned in not for information, but for drama, and everyone knew it. Jasmine Crockett arrived first. She stepped onto the stage with the precision of a seasoned performer. Her navy suit was sharp, understated, presidential. She moved like someone who had rehearsed her every gesture, and perhaps she had. Her smile was professional, her stride confident. Cameras clicked like applause. Her eyes scanned the audience, then settled calmly on her designated spot. She gave a polite nod to the moderators, crossed her hands neatly, and waited. No one doubted she was in control. 5 minutes later, Jean-Baptiste Traoré entered. He moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with the deliberate grace of a man who did not need to chase the room's attention. His suit was older, looser at the shoulders, charcoal gray and modestly pressed. No entourage trailed him, no cameras flashed upon his entrance until they realized he was there. A soft murmur spread across the audience. He looked around once, briefly locking eyes with a group of college students in the back row. They nodded. He nodded back. What no one noticed, or at least no one paid attention to, was the small sealed envelope tucked neatly into the inside breast pocket of his jacket. Cream-colored, hand-addressed, unremarkable to anyone not looking for it. He stood at his podium, adjusted the microphone once, and offered a faint smile. Jasmine glanced at him but said nothing. She didn't need to. This was her arena, her challenge, her tempo. The cameras began their slow pan. The screen behind them flashed the title card. The IQ Challenge Round 1 begins. A voiceover filled the hall. Tonight, for the first time in U.S. political history, 2 Senate candidates will undergo a live cognitive evaluation. But already something had shifted. Somewhere between the roar of lights and the countdown clock, a feeling began to take hold. Not quite fear, not yet awe, but the kind of electricity that comes before a storm. Jasmine was polished. Traoré was still. The audience leaned forward. And across the country, millions of viewers sat breathless, unaware that the envelope resting silently against one man's chest was about to change everything. A digital timer blinked onto the screen, 0030, 0. The moderator, a silver-haired academic from MIT, stepped forward to the center mic and addressed the hall. Tonight's assessment she began as a nonverbal, logic-based IQ evaluation adapted in collaboration with leading cognitive scientists and university partners to reflect modern demands of decision-making under pressure. It sounded neutral, clinical, impressive. But to anyone who looked closely, it was anything but ordinary. Jasmine's team had spent months curating the questions. Not rigged exactly, at least not in a way that could be easily challenged, but skewed. The puzzles favored abstract pattern recognition, taught in private preparatory academies, recursive language games only common in elite liberal arts programs, and split-screen simulations, simulating corporate systems and digital analytics. The test was less about intelligence and more about fluency in a specific kind of world, a world where Jasmine had always thrived. Traoré sat with his palms flat against the brushed steel table in front of him. A large touchscreen panel flickered to life beneath his fingertips. His reading glasses hung from his collar unused. He didn't need them for the first few prompts, simple shapes, color sequences, but the questions escalated fast. On screen, a virtual scenario mimicking a federal budget reallocation interface. Symbols with no key, diagrams with shifting variables, artificially compressed time limits. He paused. Across from him, Jasmine's fingers flew across her screen with the ease of someone playing a game she'd mastered long ago. She tapped, swiped, dragged elements into neat columns. Her eyes were calm, her lips slightly curled. Traoré squinted, taking his time. He reread a problem twice, then a third time. Behind him, a cough echoed, a few whispers, a rustle of movement. The camera zoomed in, lingering on his face longer than necessary. "Why's he stalling?" one host murmured in the live broadcast commentary. "Maybe he doesn't know the interface," another replied. "He's old school." Inside the hall, the tension grew quieter but sharper. He progressed through the test steadily but slowly. A question involving a simulated cybersecurity breach paused him for nearly 2 full minutes. The interface required gesture commands. He reached for a stylus that wasn't there, paused again, and finally used his finger. The delay looked awkward. One cameraman caught Jasmine watching him not maliciously, but with thinly veiled superiority. The crowd caught on. A few chuckles rippled from her side of the aisle. In the 5th row, a young staffer covered his mouth with a hand and whispered, "He's drowning." At minute 21, a question popped up involving recursive logic trees written in a programming pseudocode. Traoré's brow furrowed. He read it once, then twice. It was the first time he visibly blinked in frustration. The cameras saw it, so did Jasmine's supporters. A man from her campaign leaned over to a journalist and whispered, "She's making history tonight. He's the past." But then came something small, easily missed. Traoré placed both hands on the table, closed his eyes and breathed just once. Deep, grounded. He skipped the question and moved on. The room didn't understand it, but the gesture was intentional. He was choosing something, choosing not to play by all their rules. Still, to the audience, especially those hungry for spectacle, he was losing. The timer reached 02:14 and the final scenario appeared. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, arms folded confidently. She had completed every question. She tapped her final answer and the screen rewarded her with a subtle green pulse. Traoré tapped his screen just as the timer hit 0. He had finished, but the murmurs had already begun. On Twitter, the hashtags changed tone. Narrate dominates, Gakyun mismatch. Traoré too slow. At her podium, Jasmine kept her eyes on the screen, not gloating, but unmistakably self-assured. She turned to the moderator and offered a smile like a closing argument. But Traoré didn't look rattled. He leaned back, fingers interlaced across his chest. The envelope in his breast pocket shifted slightly unnoticed by the crowd. It wasn't time for it yet, but it would be. Soon. The test was over. The auditorium, hushed just moments earlier, now hummed with low voices and shifting feet. On stage, the moderator returned, papers in hand, face unreadable beneath the clinical calm of academia. Behind her, the large screen refreshed, preparing to display the scores. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "the results of tonight's assessment have been verified and tabulated independently." The air seemed to tighten. The audience leaned forward. A camera zoomed in on Jasmine, already composed, her expression carefully measured. She knew what was coming. The screen flickered. Jasmine Crockett, 138, Jean-Baptiste Traoré, 102. There was a beat of silence too short to be awkward, too long to be comfortable before the murmurs exploded into sound. Gasps, raised eyebrows, a low ripple of reaction moving across the hall like wind over tall grass. The number didn't disqualify Traoré, but it didn't impress either. It hovered just above average, hovering just beneath what the room had been primed to expect from a man with his credentials. In the front row, a cable news host whispered into her mic, a surprising underperformance from Traoré. This could reshape the primary field. The moderator stepped back. Jasmine took the cue, stepping up to her podium, her heels clicking softly against the polished stage. Her voice, when it came, was calm, controlled, but each word was a scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we saw a demonstration of transparency," she began, tone rich with practiced gravitas. "We asked 2 leaders to meet a challenge, to step forward, not just with passion, but with clarity, with cognitive strength, because leadership in today's America must be intelligent, not just inspirational." There it was. The crowd heard it, the coded dismissal wrapped in polished praise. She wasn't attacking him directly, but removing him inch by inch from the realm of credibility. Her smile, gentle and restrained, was almost maternal. "And while we respect all who seek to serve," she continued, "the complexity of our times demands more than heart. It demands readiness, strategy, intellect measured not in years served, but in capacity." She finished to polite applause, some louder than others. Traoré stood motionless at his podium. He didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, something inside him stirred, not anger, but memory. For a moment, the cameras faded, and his mind drifted back to a hot summer day in 1976. He was 13, running barefoot through a Bronx alleyway, chased not by bullies but by two NYPD officers who mistook his older brother's notebook for a stolen wallet. When they caught them, they didn't ask questions. They used batons. His brother had screamed for mercy. Traoré had screamed for help. No one came. Later, in a hospital hallway, a janitor, a black man named Elijah, gave him an ice pack and said, "Don't let this break you. Learn everything they know, then teach it better." Years later in law school, that voice echoed again. As he watched professors misquote legislation they assumed no one would question. He challenged them, corrected them, silently, respectfully. He hadn't outshouted the system. He'd outlasted it. He remembered building his first community center with funds scraped together from bake sales microloans and favors from old friends. How he'd written grant applications late into the night while his wife slept beside their baby daughter. How he'd spent 15 years defending teenagers accused of crimes they didn't commit, learning their names when the courts wouldn't. That man was still here, standing in a room that judged him by numbers. He looked up now, not at Jasmine, but at the people behind the lights. The ones watching from their living rooms. The retired bus drivers. The single mothers. The janitors, nurses, veterans, and dreamers who knew the weight of being underestimated. He straightened his back and stepped forward toward the microphone. But he didn't speak yet. Instead, he reached into his jacket and adjusted the envelope in his pocket, not to reveal it, not yet, but simply to remind himself it was still there. A promise he hadn't forgotten. Then he turned his gaze calmly toward the crowd and waited. The storm wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The applause for Jasmine hadn't fully died when Traoré moved. It wasn't abrupt. He didn't raise his voice or gesture grandly. He simply stepped forward, the slow, deliberate motion of a man who knew that silence, when timed right, could carry more weight than thunder. The hall grew still again. "I came here in good faith," he began, voice steady, but low, no trace of agitation. "I took this test because I believe in showing up even when the rules aren't written for you." He paused. The microphone picked up the smallest scrape of his breath. Then slowly he reached into his jacket and removed a single envelope, cream-colored, heavy, its seal unbroken, and placed it on the moderator's desk with a careful hand. The camera zoomed in reflexively. Then came the flash drive, slim silver tucked neatly inside a black velvet pouch. The moderator blinked. "What is this, Mr. Traoré?" His gaze didn't leave hers. "This test was rigged," he said, not with anger, but with the calm certainty of a surgeon delivering a diagnosis. "Crafted to favor one kind of mind, one kind of experience, one kind of background." The audience stirred, not with laughter or gasps, but with the dense, charged silence of rising disbelief. Someone coughed. Someone else dropped a pen. Traoré continued. "I've seen this before. I've lived it. From college entrance exams to housing loan criteria to courtroom biases dressed up as logic. You change the labels, but the game is the same. You write the questions so you control the answers." He gestured toward the envelope. Inside is a letter handwritten by the late Senator Franklin Crockett, Jasmine's father, detailing a private arrangement that directly affects the integrity of her campaign in this test. The camera cut sharply to Jasmine. She didn't move. Her smile, so polished just moments ago, held, but it had stopped reaching her eyes. Traoré looked back to the moderator. The flash drive contains supplementary evidence from a federal inquiry that was never made public. Until now. The moderator hesitated. This was no longer a game. This was a breach of script. Someone in the back of the room whispered, "He brought receipts." Jasmine's hands tightened on her podium. She opened her mouth, maybe to deny, maybe to pivot, but no sound came. On social media, the hashtags shifted again. Screens lit up across the country. Every network switched to live coverage. And in the hall, the air changed. The crowd wasn't whispering now. They were watching, listening, recalculating. Traoré stepped back from the mic. His posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He had simply laid the stone. It was up to the world to feel the ripple. And for the first time all night, Jasmine Crockett looked unsure. The envelope was opened off stage, out of frame, but its impact moved faster than the cameras could follow. Within minutes, a producer for the live broadcast stepped in front of the moderator's table and passed her a printed transcript, hastily marked with a yellow highlighter. Legal staff and ethics aides scrambled in the wings, eyes scanning mouths pursed. The flash drive was already being duplicated. Screens in the backstage media pit glowed with slowly unfolding documents, line by damning line. But all it took was the letter. The moderator cleared her throat. Per request and consent from both campaigns, she announced with an almost reluctant tone, the contents of the submitted letter will be read in full. The lights dimmed slightly. The room fell utterly still. She adjusted her glasses and began to read. To whom it may concern should this ever come to light. The handwriting was dated but strong. The letter was 15 years old. E. Franklin J. Crockett, U.S. Senator read, document the following in good faith. In 2009, I facilitated a confidential financial arrangement with Rystec Industries. The name alone drew a shift in the room. Rystec, a major defense contractor long suspected of manipulating overseas military contracts and cyber defense legislation. A giant with a silent grip, in which my daughter's graduate education at Stanford, along with an initial campaign fund for her congressional bid, were underwritten through discretionary project grants managed by a private political action committee affiliated with Rystec's internal lobbying wing. Gasps real this time. The moderator's voice trembled slightly, but she kept reading. In return, I ensured my position on the Senate Armed Services Committee was used to recommend a favorable review of Rystec's drone security contract in 2011. The connection was never formally documented, but the agreement was understood. Jasmine was unaware of the arrangement at the time, but I fear it may surface. Jasmine closed her eyes. And in that event, I accept full responsibility for the decisions I made to protect and promote my child's future, even at the cost of transparency. The reading ended in a silence so thick it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. Jasmine's hands were no longer poised. They were clenched at her sides. Her face was pale. She didn't speak. Couldn't. The words of her father spoken from the grave dangled like chains around her reputation. In the crowd, some leaned back uncomfortable. Others leaned in fascinated. A few shook their heads in disbelief, and among them, scattered like lit fuses, were reporters typing frantically into glowing keyboards. Traoré did not gloat. He simply stood still, watching the room react not to his power, but to the weight of truth finally laid bare. The implications hit quickly. The Rystec name was toxic, long suspected, rarely proven. Jasmine's acceptance of campaign money, however indirect, however unknowing, placed her in the shadow of corporate manipulation. Her speeches about integrity, intelligence, and leadership now echoed with hollow irony. And then came the deeper twist. The audience didn't know, but Traoré did. He'd had that letter for over 6 years. He first discovered it during a confidential ethics inquiry into PAC activities involving multiple defense contractors. At the time, Jasmine was still a rising congresswoman, vocal, idealistic, and reform-minded. Using the letter then would have destroyed her. So he hadn't. He locked it away. He had seen something in her back then, some spark of belief untouched by the machine. Perhaps he'd hoped she'd rise on her own without debt, without deception. But tonight she had stood before the nation and tried to reduce him to a number. A man's life, legacy, and struggle boiled down to a single metric. That changed everything. He hadn't revealed the letter to punish her. He revealed it to stop the illusion before it became a lie big enough to hurt millions. Jasmine now stared at the floor, her mind somewhere far from cameras, questions, or politics. Maybe she was back in her childhood bedroom reading her father's speeches. Maybe she was wondering when the dream turned into a transaction. Either way, the room no longer looked at her with reverence. They looked at her with recognition, the kind that says you are not who we thought you were. And somewhere inside her she knew. They were right. The moderator hadn't even finished reading the letter when a tech assistant from the network emerged from backstage, holding a laptop already connected to the flash drive. A second producer handed her a printed index of the files. There were hundreds of folders labeled with pass aliases, encrypted email threads, internal memos, and donation transfer logs. The moderator, visibly shaken, glanced over the list, then picked a file at the top marked Confidential, June 2013, Jur, Ecom Chain, Rear Nathaniel. She clicked it open. On screen appeared a series of emails between a campaign coordinator named Nathaniel Frakes, now deceased, and an unnamed offshore shell corporation, operating under a Delaware registration number. The emails detailed the use of small LLCs to funnel donations into Jasmine Crockett's early congressional campaign, long before her first televised appearance back when she was just that brilliant senator's daughter trying to run in a crowded district. Each message was filled with cautious language, but unmistakable intent. Package delivered. Wire confirmation received from Reichstag Zurich branch. Split the ledger, use the bridge company in Albany. Jasmine will be in D.C. next week. Keep her one step removed. Senator signed off. Jasmine doesn't need to know full channel, just keep funds clean on entry. But as the messages continued, the language began to shift. She's asking questions now. We need to brief her fully. She's agreed to maintain message control. Her pitch aligns with defense modernization. Use her as the face-clean young articulate. The rest stays in the background. And then the final one, a short reply from Jasmine herself. Understood. If we're going forward, I want control over the language in any legislation tied to funding. We keep this quiet. You keep your hands off my staff. The moderator stopped reading aloud. She didn't need to say anything. The projection did the work. Gasps now gave way to stunned silence. Journalists weren't typing, they were staring. The implication was no longer circumstantial. It was complicity. She hadn't just been a passive beneficiary of her father's backroom deals. She had at some point understood the machinery and made the decision to ride it. Maybe it was pressure, maybe it was ambition, maybe both. But there it was in her own words. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't need to explain. The documents did the speaking. And though the media had been quick to broadcast Jasmine's polished IQ score only minutes earlier, they now focused on each new file with surgical obsession. Tweets exploded. Cable anchors broke format. Legal analysts began whispering words like violation, fraud, Federal Election Commission, and grand jury. But what no one outside that hall yet knew, not the moderators, not Jasmine, not even Traoré's own staff, was that this moment had been months in the making. Traoré had found the flash drive a year ago. It had been mailed anonymously to a former Justice Department colleague of his, now a cybersecurity professor, just weeks after Nathaniel Frakes was found dead in an apparent suicide. No note, no foul play found. But the contents of the drive painted a clear picture. A man who knew too much and was silenced by systems too careful to leave fingerprints. At the time, Traoré hadn't wanted to believe it. He had tucked the letter and the flash drive away, hoping he'd never need to use them. But Jasmine's decision to challenge him publicly on intellect, on worthiness, on perception, had triggered something deeper than political rivalry. It had triggered memory. He'd seen this before. Not the exact scam, but the anatomy of it. Young leaders, brilliant and idealistic, seduced by the machinery of power. Told it was how things work. Promised they'd have control. Told their complicity was strategy. That the ends justified the means. And he'd watched enough of them fall to know some only saw the truth after the fire. So he set the stage, accepted the test, knew she wouldn't be able to resist designing it, knew she'd be too confident to hold back, that she would weaponize her platform and by doing so open herself to the mirror he was now holding up. The test hadn't been a trap. It had been bait, and she'd taken it. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural in a room so large. 1,000 people sat frozen in the Eisenhower Freedom Hall, their collective breath caught between disbelief and discomfort. The screen still displayed fragments of the whistleblower's emails glowing like silent indictments in bold clinical font. The only sound was the hum of the lights overhead and the slow, restless tapping of a single pen in the back row, forgotten, rhythmic, anxious. Jasmine Crockett stood behind her podium, her posture unchanged but hollowed. The polish in her expression had drained, leaving something brittle in its place. Not panic, not denial, but a flicker of internal collapse. She stared at the floor, lips parted slightly, as if the right words might materialize if she just stayed still enough. They didn't. Across the stage, Traoré hadn't moved. He stood quietly, hands folded in front of him as though attending a funeral. And in a way, he was the burial of a false narrative, long curated, dressed in ambition, and paraded before the nation. The moderator opened her mouth to speak, thought better of it, and simply lowered the tablet in her hands. She looked to the producers, who now hovered behind the curtains, unsure whether to cut the feed or lean in further. The journalists, once chatty and sharp, had gone strangely quiet. Some stared at their laptops. Others typed blindly, unsure of tone or headline. No one wanted to be first. No one wanted to get it wrong. This wasn't a scandal, it was a reckoning. Jasmine's supporters, once lined with confident smiles and pre-rehearsed applause, now sat with their hands in their laps. One man whispered something to the woman beside him. She shook her head. He stopped talking. And then finally Traoré stepped forward. Not dramatically, not with a flourish. He simply stepped into the silence and let it settle around him like a coat he'd worn before. I didn't come here to win a test. He said, his voice low but steady, caring without force. I came to protect the truth, even when it hurts. He let the words hang there unadorned. I took your challenge not to defend myself, he continued, looking directly at Jasmine, who still could not meet his eyes, but to give the people watching, the ones without microphones or PACs or lawyers, a chance to see what's real. To see that integrity doesn't always come dressed in performance. No applause followed, none was needed. The words weren't meant to impress. They were meant to endure. He stepped back once more, hands at his sides. The envelope had been opened. The files had been read. The trap had been revealed, not as vengeance, but as warning. And for the first time since the evening began, the spotlight no longer belonged to Jasmine Crockett. It belonged to the silence she had left behind. By dawn, America had already made up its mind. Screens across the country flickered to life with bold headlines splashed in digital red: Jasmine exposed IQ test. Backfires spectacularly. Traoré holds moral. High ground amid scandal. The media didn't just report it, they devoured it. Cable anchors ran split-screen footage of Jasmine's silent stare, on stage beside freeze frames of her father's letter and the damning line from her own email. Morning talk shows framed it as the fall of a modern political dynasty. Editorials, once cautious in tone, now openly dissected her ambition as arrogance cloaked in intellect. Even the late-night hosts, typically dancing around real controversy, couldn't resist. That IQ test, one quipped. Turns out the smartest guy in the room was the one who didn't design it. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, the machinery of consequence had already started turning. Two members of the House Ethics Committee scheduled an emergency briefing to review campaign finance records tied to Reichstag. Subcommittees floated language about launching a formal hearing. Quietly, a few junior representatives from Jasmine's own party began to distance themselves, issuing statements full of carefully worded disappointment, and her donors noticed. By mid-morning, 3 major contributors had suspended their funding. 2 more paused communications. A prominent Silicon Valley CEO removed Jasmine's photo from the company's website under the section titled "Future Voices We Support." Inside her DC townhouse, Jasmine sat on the floor of her study, surrounded by open folders, half-drunk coffee, and the relentless hum of a muted TV. Her campaign manager had stopped calling. Her comms team was reportedly in full reassessment mode. For the first time in years, Jasmine Crockett had nothing to say. Her phone buzzed. She didn't answer. A message lit up on screen: C-SPAN, Liv Traoré speaks outside community center. She almost swiped it away, but curiosity, or perhaps guilt, held her thumb back. She tapped it. The screen showed Traoré in a windbreaker standing outside a brick building in southeast DC, surrounded not by journalists or donors, but by volunteers distributing canned goods and winter coats. A small crowd had gathered. Phones were out, not to catch a soundbite, but to remember the moment. Mr. Traoré, a young journalist, asked, "Do you have any comment on last night's fallout?" He looked up from tying a coat around a child's shoulders and said simply, "I think people saw what they needed to see. I'll let them decide what it means." The reporter pressed, "Are you celebrating?" Traoré shook his head. "There's too much to fix to celebrate." He returned to work. Back in the townhouse, Jasmine let the video play twice. 3 times. She hadn't slept. Her makeup from the night before was still faintly visible beneath her eyes. Her laptop sat open beside her, displaying a half-written draft of an apology she no longer knew how to finish. The words felt empty because they were. She rose slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the gray morning. In the quiet, her mind drifted to a moment from law school, the first time she ever met Traoré. He'd guest lectured on civil rights law, standing at the front of a crowded auditorium, talking not about cases, but about stories, about the weight of injustice and the cost of complicity. She remembered how everyone leaned forward as he spoke, as if the room itself were trying to get closer. She'd envied that then. She had thought, one day I'll command a room like that. Now she understood. It wasn't about command, it was about credibility. And she had traded hers away, one polished decision at a time. Outside, the clouds thickened. Rain touched the edge of the windows. Jasmine didn't reach for her phone again. She just stood there. And for the first time in her career, she waited. The rain hadn't stopped by evening. It tapped softly on the windows of Jasmine Crockett's townhouse, like a metronome of memory. She sat alone on the edge of her leather couch, legs drawn close, the house unnervingly silent. The soft glow of the television flickered across the room, though the volume was barely audible. She wasn't watching it for the words. She was watching it for him. On the screen, Traoré moved slowly through a crowded homeless encampment under a freeway overpass. He wasn't surrounded by cameras or handlers. No podium, no slogans, no campaign banners. Just him in a rain-slick coat, bending slightly to listen to a woman with two children wrapped in towels. He didn't talk over her. He didn't correct her. He listened. And Jasmine, for once, couldn't look away. She thought about how different they were, and how frighteningly similar. Her gaze drifted to the fireplace unlit, then up to the tall family portrait above the mantel. There he was, Senator Franklin Crockett, towering, unsmiling, his hand resting stiffly on her 12-year-old shoulder like a royal stamp of ownership. She remembered the day that photo was taken. She had wanted to wear her sneakers. He'd insisted on patent leather shoes with hard soles that hurt her heels. She had wanted to smile naturally. He told her to show poise. Never let them see you soft, he had said. Softness is weakness in this town. She hadn't understood it then, but she learned. By the time she entered middle school, she already knew how to shake hands like a senator, speak in sound bites, and memorize facts not to learn but to win. There were no play dates, only briefings. No mistakes, only lessons. And every lesson ended the same way, her father saying, "You'll thank me when you're sitting in my chair." She never did, but she kept sitting in every chair he laid in front of her. Debate team captain, valedictorian, Rhodes Scholar finalist, congressional intern, district spokesperson, then the youngest elected congresswoman in her state's history. Every step calculated, every line rehearsed, and somewhere along the way she had stopped asking why. The first time a donor offered to fast-track funding through a PAC, she hesitated, but only briefly. Her campaign manager called it routine. Her father called it leverage. And Jasmine, hungry for autonomy, told herself it was just how the system worked. But that wasn't the worst moment. The worst moment was when she stopped feeling bad about it. And that moment, the moment her moral compass didn't scream, was the moment she began losing pieces of herself. She hadn't meant to deceive the public, not consciously. She believed in climate reform and education equity, in criminal justice overhaul. But she had allowed herself to think that the ends justified the means, that a clean mind could wear a dirty coat if it still walked the right direction. But Traoré's calm voice from the night before echoed in her now like thunder. "I didn't come here to win a test. I came to protect the truth. Even when it hurts. Even when it hurts." Jasmine reached for the remote but didn't turn the television off. Traoré was now laughing softly with a man in a wheelchair handing him a bowl of hot soup. He didn't look like he'd just dismantled a political dynasty. He looked like a man who'd woken up and gone to work the same work he'd been doing before anyone knew his name. That's what gnawed at her most. He wasn't using her downfall to raise himself. He didn't need to. His foundation had been built in truth, so he had nothing to protect, nothing to perform, nothing to polish. Hers, on the other hand, had been layered in expectation and reinforced by ambition until the original beams of purpose had rotted without her noticing. And now it had collapsed, not in a scandal, in silence. The kind of silence that demanded reflection. So she sat in it. Let it linger. And somewhere deep inside her, for the first time in a long time, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel like a politician or a prodigy or a headline. She just felt human. The campaign war room was buzzing, but Traoré remained still. Outside the window, Washington's skyline shimmered beneath a pale afternoon haze. Inside, voices overlapped, consultants, strategizing volunteers, debating op-eds, legal aids, discussing possible subpoenas against Jasmine Crockett's former staff. The polls were shifting in his favor by the hour. Donors were offering new commitments. Talk of a landslide had already begun to surface. And yet Traoré sat quietly at the far end of the table, his hands clasped, listening. "We need to strike while the wound is open," said Helena Nguyen, his campaign manager, flipping through printouts. "Town halls, ads, full media circuit. Let people know you're the one with clean hands. We already have 3 networks requesting exclusives," added a young comms aide. "Even NPR wants in. It's yours to define now." Another voice chimed in. "We draft a statement framing this as a referendum on character, hers versus yours. The contrast sells itself." But Traoré didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the only window in the room and stared out at the people below, walking, talking, carrying grocery bags, pushing strollers, hurrying to catch buses. The very people the campaigns claimed to fight for, yet rarely took time to hear. Finally, he spoke. "We're not running against her," he said evenly. "We're running for them." The room quieted. Helena hesitated. "John, with all respect, she tried to end your credibility on national television." "What she did, I know what she did," he interrupted gently. "And I know what I didn't do. I didn't lie to anyone to get here. I didn't raise my hand to tear someone down so I could climb higher. That's not going to change just because we've been handed a microphone." Helena nodded reluctantly. She knew there would be no victory tour. When the room cleared out, Traoré walked back to his desk. A legal pad lay open, its top sheet blank. He sat down, uncapped a pen, and began to write not a press statement or a policy memo, but a letter, addressed not to the media, not to donors, but to Jasmine Crockett. The words came slowly, carefully. "Jasmine, I know what it feels like to believe you must carry your father's name like armor. I also know what it costs to take it off." He paused. "You don't owe the world a defense, but you do owe yourself the truth. If you ever decide to rebuild on something stronger, I'll be there not as an opponent, but as a witness to what you could become." He signed it, folded it once, and placed it in a plain envelope. No stamp, no postmark, just a message that needed no stage to matter. They met in a small, unused classroom at a public library in Ward 8. No cameras, no entourage, just the kind of space where real conversation still happened. Jasmine arrived early. She had debated canceling, twice told herself it was a bad idea, that it would be performative, humiliating. But something about the handwritten letter, folded, not emailed, addressed only to Jasmine, not Congresswoman Crockett, had pierced through the media noise. It hadn't accused or condemned. It had simply seen her, and she couldn't ignore that. She wore no makeup, no stylist, a gray wool coat too heavy for the season. Her eyes were tired but clear. When Traoré entered, he gave her a small nod. No smile, just acknowledgement. He carried nothing but a thermos of tea. They sat opposite each other at a child-sized table with laminated edges and peeling cartoon letters taped to the walls around them. For a while, neither spoke. Jasmine finally broke the silence. "You didn't have to be merciful," she said quietly. "I wasn't," Traoré replied. "I was honest." She looked down. He continued, voice steady. "I don't believe in destroying people, but I do believe in truth." That night wasn't about vengeance. It was about drawing a line. Jasmine nodded slowly but didn't defend herself. There was nothing left to defend. "My father taught me to win," she said. "Taught me that losing meant becoming invisible, forgotten." Traoré leaned back slightly. "So did mine," he said. "But the difference was he had no illusion that the world would ever let us win unless we changed the game itself." She met his gaze for the first time. "You think I'm beyond changing?" "No," he said simply. "I think you're right at the edge of it." She didn't cry. She didn't crack. But something inside her shifted, something rigid, inherited, perhaps even worshipped, finally giving way to a quieter shape. Traoré opened his thermos and poured 2 paper cups of tea. The silence returned gentler this time. Then he spoke again. "There's a community roundtable next week," he said. "Ward 7. No press, just folks. They'll be talking about campaign ethics, neighborhood displacement, school funding. I'd like you to come." She blinked. "As what? A cautionary tale?" "As a citizen." Her throat tightened. "You think they'll even want me there?" "They won't trust you." "Not at first," he said. "But they'll hear you. If you're willing to speak plainly, not like a candidate, like a person." Jasmine looked at the floor, then the tea in her hand. The smell reminded her of the Senegalese tea her father used to drink during long committee hearings. He said it made him think clearer. She wondered what he'd say if he saw her now, if he'd be disappointed or just annoyed she didn't fight harder. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. "Readiness," Traoré said, "is a privilege people like us rarely have. Do it anyway." She laughed once softly. "You really don't let people off easy." He shrugged. "I let them stand up." They sat a while longer in companionable silence. Two former rivals no longer clashing, but circling the same question. "What now?" Jasmine took a slow sip from her paper cup. "Ward 7, she said more to herself than him. "All right." Traoré gave no reaction beyond a slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something better. It was an invitation. The community center in Ward 7 was modest faded posters on the wall, a few sagging ceiling tiles, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Folding chairs formed a rough circle in the center of the room. No podium, no stage. Just a table with paper cups, a bowl of peppermint candies, and a coffee dispenser that hissed every few minutes. Jasmine Crockett stepped through the door precisely 5 minutes early. The conversations in the room faltered as people turned to see her. She felt it immediately, the tightening, the quiet skepticism, the sideways glances. A few folded their arms. One man shook his head and muttered under his breath. Another woman leaned closer to her friend and whispered just loud enough for Jasmine to hear, "What's she doing here?" No one greeted her. She took an empty seat near the edge of the circle, her coat still buttoned, hands folded tightly in her lap. Traoré was already there across the room, speaking quietly with a retired school principal. He didn't acknowledge her arrival with anything more than a subtle nod, not because he was cold, but because this wasn't his moment. It was hers. The meeting began with small items, updates on food distribution, youth center renovations, questions about school zoning. Jasmine stayed quiet, listening. People spoke plainly with frustration and fatigue, sharpened by years of being ignored. When the discussion shifted to campaign accountability, the facilitator, a middle-aged librarian named Gloria, glanced over at Jasmine. The pause was subtle but loud. "All right," Gloria said. "I guess we can talk about the elephant in the room." The circle stiffened. Gloria turned toward Jasmine. "You've got the floor, Congresswoman." Jasmine let the title hang there for a second too long. Then she took a breath. "I'm not here as a congresswoman," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm here because I failed." A ripple went through the room, not acceptance, but attention. She continued. "I made decisions that I believed were necessary. I rationalized shortcuts because I told myself the outcome justified them. I believed I could stay clean in a dirty system if I just kept my hands steady enough." Someone scoffed near the back. Jasmine heard it. She didn't flinch. "The truth is, I was raised inside that system, groomed to win, not to reflect. I wasn't taught to listen. I was taught to speak first, control the room, stay one step ahead. Somewhere along the way, I mistook control for leadership, and by the time I realized it, I had already let it define me." The room was silent now. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "I just came to speak plainly." "You deserve that." She let the quiet settle. It was long and uncomfortable, like a verdict hanging in the air. Then from the very back a woman stood. She was older, wearing a church pin on her lapel and holding a yellow notepad in her lap. She looked directly at Jasmine, then around the room. "I made those mistakes too," she said. Her voice was strong but not angry. "I worked for a housing board in the 90s. Took money from a developer I knew had plans to push families out. Told myself it would help fund job training programs. I stayed quiet when I should have shouted. Did nothing when I should have fought." She looked back at Jasmine. "You're not special in your shame, but you're brave for bringing it here." Another woman nodded, then a man. A young teacher leaned forward in his chair. The room didn't erupt into applause. It didn't need to. What shifted was heavier than sound. It was recognition. The kind that lives not in admiration, but in understanding. Jasmine sat a little straighter, not out of pride, but release. Traoré across the room said nothing, but he smiled, not for her, not for show, but for the moment itself. Something real had just begun. The press didn't catch wind of the meeting until days later, and by then the story had already changed. There were no headlines screaming scandal this time, No viral clips, no backroom leaks. Just a quiet, unexpected announcement buried in the middle of a midweek policy briefing. Senatorial candidate Jean-Baptiste Traoré was drafting a bipartisan bill aimed at overhauling campaign finance loopholes at the federal level. What made the brief catch attention wasn't the bill itself, it was the name listed quietly beside his. Jasmine Crockett. No speech, no joint press conference, no photo op handshake, just her name printed beneath the proposal like a second breath. Behind the scenes, the work had been deliberate. The bill was still in early stages, focused on closing shell-packed loopholes, increasing real-time donor transparency, and limiting foreign-adjacent holding structures. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a beginning. The kind of legislation that was too boring for TV and too honest for most lobbyists. When Traoré's team reviewed the draft for final signatories, he slid the folder across the table to Jasmine, now weeks removed from headlines, stripped of title but not a voice. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name with quiet practice strokes. "I won't speak for it publicly," she said, not as a condition, but a confession. "Not yet. Not until I've earned that back." Traoré nodded. The signature's enough. The silence is honest. There was no performance in the moment, just paperwork and two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a line now walking beside it. Outside, spring had begun creeping in. The dogwoods in the public park near the office had bloomed early. Families returned to the benches. Joggers traced the old path around the reflecting pool. Inside, the air felt different, lighter. For the first time in weeks, neither of them felt like they were fighting gravity. "This won't fix everything," Jasmine said almost to herself. No, Traoré agreed, "but it'll keep it from getting worse." He tapped the folder once, then looked up. "Politics doesn't need heroes. It needs grown-ups." That line stayed with her long after they parted. She walked alone through the park after the meeting coat slung over her arm and thought about how strange it felt to contribute without demanding to be seen. How difficult and rare it was to offer something and ask nothing in return. Not forgiveness, not redemption, not power. Just progress. That night, the bill's summary was published quietly on the congressional docket. Only a handful of reporters noticed. Fewer still covered it. But in one small neighborhood newsletter just beneath the calendar of local cleanup events, a headline read, "Former Rivals Unite Over Real Reform." No photos, no quotes, just a beginning. There were no grand stages, no security barricades, no curated optics or anthemic walk-on music. Just folding chairs, local cafes, high school gyms, and borrowed church basements. That's where Jean-Baptiste Traoré showed up week after week, sleeves rolled tie, forgotten eyes focused not on the press, but on the people. The town halls weren't televised. They weren't designed to go viral. They were slow, sweaty, sometimes chaotic conversations that stretched for hours, often running late into the night. And yet, they were full. In towns where voter turnout had dipped below 20% for 2 decades, people came. Farmers, factory workers, single parents, exhausted teachers, ex-offenders, high school students with first-time voter cards in their wallets. They didn't always come to agree. Some came angry, some came confused, some came just to be heard. But they came. Traoré didn't pitch policy first. He started with stories, his own, theirs. He asked more questions than he answered. He brought maps, not graphs, let people draw lines around their communities, show him where the buses stopped too early, where grocery stores had disappeared, where schools turned into ghost buildings with overworked staff and underpaid dreams. He ended every town hall the same way. "Politics doesn't live in Washington," he said. "It lives in rooms like this, in the chairs you sit in the voices you raise." And people began to believe him. Across the state, the ripple turned into rhythm. Local organizers revived neighborhood coalitions. Barbershops handed out flyers. Food banks stapled voter registration forms to bags of rice and beans. In places once called disengaged, civic momentum bloomed like spring flowers in concrete. But the most surprising part of the movement didn't come from Traoré. It came from Jasmine Crockett. She didn't announce her efforts. She didn't tweet them. There were no logos or slogans. She simply appeared quietly without title at community colleges, adult learning centers, shelters, and libraries, carrying stacks of voter education packets and offering to teach. She ran free workshops on how to read a ballot, how to identify reliable news sources, how to report voter suppression tactics. Sometimes 3 people showed up, sometimes 30. She answered questions without speeches. When asked why she was there, she just said, "Because I should have been doing this all along." Word spread not loudly but sincerely. People noticed. A woman who had once spoken up at the Ward 7 roundtable now co-hosted with Jasmine. A local grocery owner began keeping voter forms at the register. A teacher invited her to speak to night students who worked day shifts at warehouses and bus depots. Traoré never commented publicly on Jasmine's efforts. He didn't need to. But one night after a town hall in a Rust Belt town 30 miles outside the capital, he received a photo from a volunteer. It showed Jasmine at a public library, bent over a folding table with a grandmother and her teenage grandson, helping them both fill out their first ever voter registration cards. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he smiled. It wasn't redemption that mattered. It was return. Return to purpose. Return to people. Return to truth that wasn't polished but practiced. And in this quiet civic revival born not from slogans, but from sincerity, something unexpected had begun to take root. Hope. The second round of debates looked nothing like the first. Gone were the glossy venues, the studio lighting the moderators with earpieces and corporate sponsorships. This time the debates came to the people. Community centers, middle school auditoriums, open-air pavilions with creaky folding chairs and whirring fans. There were no scoreboards, no applause meters, just a microphone, a circle of chairs, and an audience ready to ask real questions. The format was simple. Each candidate took turns answering questions submitted by citizens, some written, some shouted from the floor. No timed rebuttals, no canned monologues, only the honesty they could offer in the moment. Jasmine Crockett returned to the fold hesitantly, at first unsure how she'd be received. But she came not as a polished prodigy, but as someone rebuilding herself from the rubble. Her tone was quieter now, measured. Her campaign had all but dissolved, replaced by a small volunteer team made up mostly of people she had met in her voter literacy workshops. At the first town hall-style debate in Richmond, a retired postal worker stood up and asked her directly, "Why should we trust you again?" Jasmine didn't flinch. "I'm not asking you to," she said plainly. "I'm just showing up because showing up is where trust starts." In another forum, a college student pressed her on campaign finance corruption. She didn't deflect. She detailed the very PAC structures that once helped her win, explaining how they functioned and how she supported legislation to dismantle them, including the bill she had quietly co-signed with Traoré. Not everyone forgave her. Some didn't clap. Some shook their heads. But no one called her dishonest, because she wasn't running from the questions. She was walking into them. And Traoré noticed. In a televised town hall in Norfolk, he was asked point blank by a local barber, "Why not finish her off? Why share a stage with someone who tried to smear you?" Traoré looked across the room where Jasmine sat listening with her hands in her lap. He took a breath. "Because staying in the arena after the world's turned on you takes a different kind of courage," he said. "It's easy to stand tall when you're winning. It's harder to keep standing when you've fallen and still choose to face the people." The room quieted. It wasn't an endorsement, but it was something deeper, a recognition of her humanity and the slow, painful work of earning grace without asking for it. From then on, their debates took on a different tone. They still disagreed on tax reform, on education funding formulas, on infrastructure allocation. But their exchanges were deliberate, informed, and without venom. Their conversations invited nuance, not noise. And the voters noticed. Viewership didn't spike because of drama. It grew because people felt like they were finally being spoken with, not spoken at. One paper called it a masterclass in grown-up politics. Another headline read, "From Enemies to Examples." By the end of the last debate, both candidates shook hands in front of a modest crowd in a high school gym. No cameras caught it, no network broadcast it, but those who were there remembered. And word traveled not as a scandal, but as a story worth telling. The sun rose early on election day, casting a soft gold across city rooftops and rolling hills. In towns, big and small lines began forming outside polling places before doors even opened. Grandmothers with walkers, teenagers voting for the first time, factory workers fresh off the night shift, People brought lawn chairs, coffee, even radios playing soft jazz while they waited. No one seemed to mind. It was the kind of turnout organizers dreamed of and analysts never predicted. By noon, state officials confirmed what was already apparent: voter turnout was shattering records. In some precincts, the numbers surpassed even presidential elections. Counties once labeled politically dormant were now lighting up the map with unprecedented engagement. It wasn't just the headlines or scandals or debates that drew them. It was the sense that for once, someone was listening. The polls buzzed with a quiet intensity. There were no shouting matches, no campaign surrogates in branded jackets crowding the entrances. Just voters. Voters with stories. Voters with stakes. Voters who, for the first time in a long time, felt like their vote might mean something beyond strategy. Exit polls rolled in steadily throughout the day. Traoré held a commanding lead. His support spanned demographics: young voters, older voters, rural and urban, independent and undecided. Analysts were stunned by the breadth. What was once called a long-shot campaign now looked like a movement with roots deeper than anyone realized. But buried within the data was something unexpected. Jasmine Crockett wasn't winning, but she wasn't invisible. Her favorability ratings had rebounded slowly, quietly. Voters who once dismissed her now marked her as respectable, resilient, even honest. Not because she regained power, but because she hadn't walked away when she lost it. She didn't host a rally that day. Instead, she spent the morning volunteering at a polling station in a low-income district, handing out water bottles, guiding elderly voters to curbside assistance, staying out of sight but not out of reach. When a young woman recognized her and asked if she still had plans to run again someday, Jasmine smiled and said, "Right now, I'm just here to help others cast theirs." Back at campaign headquarters, Traoré declined the offer of a victory speech draft. "We'll wait for the people," he said. "They've waited long enough for us." And as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, the numbers continued to climb. But something more important had already emerged. The election wasn't just a contest. It had become a conversation. And no matter the result, both names on the ballot had helped turn the country, even briefly, toward a quieter, more honest kind of politics. Jean-Baptiste Traoré won in a landslide. The numbers weren't close: a decisive victory across nearly every county. When reporters gathered for his victory speech that evening, expecting a triumphant address, Traoré stepped onto the stage, smiled, and handed the microphone to someone else. A woman in her 30s, standing quietly near the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. She was a single mother working 2 jobs and had voted for the first time that year. With a trembling voice, she said, "I didn't think people like me mattered in rooms like this. He made me believe we do." That was the speech. Traoré didn't say a word after that. He bowed his head, shook hands, and walked off stage. At the inauguration, Jasmine Crockett sat unnoticed in the back row, her coat buttoned tight, a soft smile trembling at the corners. When Traoré placed his hand on the Constitution to take the oath, she blinked hard but didn't look away. It wasn't just his win she was witnessing. It was the redemption of everything politics had once promised to be. Weeks after the inauguration, a letter appeared on the official website of Senator Traoré, addressed not to voters, donors, or pundits, but to the next generation of public servants. He called it a letter to those who dare. "The tests that matter aren't written on paper," he wrote. "They're lived. In how you treat people who can't repay you. In the choices you make when no one's watching. In what you're willing to lose to do what's right." He wrote of mistakes, his own and others, of compromise, of fear, of ego, and how, if left unchecked, those things become the very systems we claim to fight against. "Lead with courage, not calculation," he urged. "Speak plainly. Listen more. Stand up even when the ground feels thin." He ended not with policy but with principle. You don't need to be perfect, but you do need to be present, again and again. Because in the end, it's not intelligence that outlasts time, it's integrity. The letter was shared in classrooms, printed in newspapers, framed in community centers. It was less a farewell than a passing of the torch. Soft piano plays over a closing montage. Jasmine stands before a night class of adult learners writing on a whiteboard. Civic power begins with understanding. Her voice is calm, her movement steady. No cameras, just a room of people trying to reclaim their voices, and one woman helping them do it. Across town, Traoré walks slowly through the halls of the Capitol. No entourage, Just him nodding quietly to staff stopping to listen when someone speaks, shaking hands like it still means something. As he exits into the cold morning light, his words from the letter echo. In the end, integrity outlasts intelligence. And compassion, my friends, is the highest IQ there is. The screen fades to black. No victory banner, no anthem, just a quiet moment. And a nation perhaps beginning again. In a world where intelligence is often measured in numbers and titles, Traoré reminded us that true wisdom lies in courage, humility, and lived experience. He didn't raise his voice or strike back in anger. He simply told the truth, and the truth was powerful enough to shake the room. Jasmine's fall wasn't just political. It was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that the systems we inherit often shape us more than we realize. This story isn't just about politics, it's about redemption. It's about how we choose to lead and who we choose to listen to. Have you ever witnessed quiet integrity change the course of a conversation or a life? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.